Good evening and welcome to our webinar regarding Great Salt Lake. My name is Jan Streifel and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and a participant on the current water issues in Utah update of several plans that the League had done previously. And so much had happened that we felt it was important to update that plan and get more current information. So that you know, the League is a nonpartisan, nonprofit political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. It works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. I'm going to give a kind of a brief, and it's very brief, summary of the report. It's a fairly lengthy report. It does have an executive summary that covers most of the issues, but just to get us all on the same page. As I said, the report updates for previous studies going back as far as 2009. It's a statewide look at the water supply, demand, use, and management. And for instance, according to the state water plan, 79% of the water that we get in Utah goes to agriculture, and the other 21% is used by municipal and industrial uses. Of those municipal and industrial uses, about 8 to 10% is used by residential. One of our key findings, and most important finding, was that we are using more water than is supplied from the natural precipitation, which is our primary source of water. Thus, we're depleting reservoirs and groundwater sources, and we're shrinking Great Salt Lake. This isn't news to you. All of you have heard this for many months now. In order to bleak what appears to be a rather bleak future, in order to reverse that, we need to change our habits, our behaviors, and our expectations, our lifestyles, and our minds about how we do things. Everyone that we spoke with, and we interviewed several people throughout the almost a year-long process, everyone, including, agrees that conservation is really the answer to our immediate problems. And that involves everyone from farmers and municipal and industrial sources to homeowners and businesses. All of these experts agree that conservation is the most effective, cost-effective, easiest to implement, and the most timely in terms of action. It can happen much more quickly than building dams, pipelines, whatever other options are out there. In order to make all of this happen, we need much more public education. We need a strong commitment from our leaders and legislators. We need to reevaluate our practices and policies. We might need to change our legal system and rules and regulations related to water. So it's a big task, but the people of Utah are really the only ones that can make these changes. It's basically on us. In the report, we identified two major priorities, Great Salt Lake and Colorado River. Thus, this webinar is focused on Great Salt Lake. So I'm going to talk briefly about Great Salt Lake, and most of what I say you will have heard many times, but we're going to say it again anyway. As you know, Great Salt Lake is a global, national, and local resource of vital importance at all levels, and its future is really in our hands alone. You've heard the news. It's a vital link, the Pacific Flyway. It connects South America with the Arctic, where millions of shorebirds travel each year in order to find food, habitat, raise their young, and that has been severely damaged. And in fact, I sadly say today that we do not have any white pelicans on the lake right now. Toxic dust, you've heard a lot about that. It's a health emergency. It affects children and older adults in the worst way, but it affects all of us. What we used to call a positive, the lake effect, where the lake contributed to the snowpack and the water that we capture in the mountains and that supplies our sources, is turning into a negative because the dust is blowing to the snow, covering it with gray and brown matter, which attracts sunlight and heat, and thus the snowpack is melting much more quickly than it used to. So that's a concern. Economically, the industries along the Great Salt Lake contribute over $2 billion annually, and that amounts to 9,000 jobs. And they're in jeopardy. Just as importantly, I think the lake is a source of inspiration for artists, sculptors, painters, poets have all expressed their admiration and the beauty of the lake. And also, it is a spiritual symbol to Native American peoples who have lived in this area, most notably the northwest band of the Shoshone Nation, where these people actually believe that the lake is central to their creation story. And last but not least, it's a cultural icon for the state of Utah and for Salt Lake City. And it's threatened, it's damaged, it's on the verge of collapse. And reversing this downward trend requires all of us. It's our responsibility, as we often say, it's all hands on deck. We are the ones that need to fix this. So with that as a little bit of background, I would like our panelists to spend some time. I neglected to introduce our panelists. They are Brian Steed, who is our new current first Great Salt Lake Commissioner. And he'll talk a little bit about his work and his job. We have Teresa Wilhelmsen, who is our state engineer and responsible for everything about water rights in the state of Utah. And then we have Nate Blouin, who is a state senator in our legislature and has a great interest in Great Salt Lake. So with that, Brian, would you like to take over?
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks, Jen. I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate for everyone's interest on being here this evening. It's something that I get to talk about a lot, but it's also something I'm quite passionate about. And with your permission, I'm going to share screen. So I'll go through a little bit of a PowerPoint on where we are in the lake. And Jan, I'm going to retread some of the territory you just covered, but never repetition, I think, is something good oftentimes. So let me share that. Okay, did that come up by chance?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about watersheds first, if that's all right. And I can't see, does it show all the side slides as well, or just the one?
It shows the slides on the side as well.
That's going to be okay. So as long as you can suffer through that technical malfunction on my part, we'll get through this together. As you can see, the major watersheds that feed the Great Salt Lake are the Bear River Basin, the Weaver River Basin, the Jordan River Basin, the Utah Lake Basin, and this whole thing in the West Desert Basin. And that becomes quite important because that's a lot of our population center in Utah. But it also, interestingly enough, based on our human engineering, we have now connected the Uinta Basin and then the greater Colorado system into the Great Salt Lake Basin through the Central Utah Project. So really, when we're talking about the impact of the Great Salt Lake, it is from pretty well the entirety of the state. So let's talk about why we should care. First of all, the Great Salt Lake in 1984 went from what was quite a large lake into something that really has shrunk quite a lot. The animation is not playing here, but if you see this play over time, you would see a fair amount of loss in the lake. Here you see can you guys see my cursor? So you see right here is what we call the Union Pacific Causeway. The Union Pacific Causeway came across the lake some years ago and really divided the lake into two sections, the north arm and the south arm. And what's interesting over time, as we've seen this go, the north arm and the south arm have become quite distinct in how they appear. And you can actually see on the satellite imagery a different coloration. The north arm has become over time quite saline. So saline, in fact, that it is now really only inhabited by two types of bacteria. That those bacteria, when they get there's a lot of them, they turn that section of the lake pink. It's almost the color of pink lemonade, which is interesting. But when we're talking about biological functionality of the lake, almost nothing else can survive there. I'll point out one thing. This one I'm circling right here, that's Gunnison Island. And when Jan talked about where the white pelicans are no longer on the lake, and if I could get this animation to play, it would be better. But oh well. This island right now is now high and dry. And because of that, you have other animals, say coyotes and other things that have been able to access that very important rookery. And so that combined with avian flu has really decimated that white pelican population on Gunnison Island. So let's talk about other issues then, though, on this. Let's talk about the salinity problem just generally. There is a Goldilocks problem. These beautiful creatures right here are brine shrimp. Brine shrimp, we call them sea monkeys. I, as a boy, wanted very much to raise sea monkeys, and now I get to be the overseer of all these excellent critters. They're really important, but those brine shrimp will only survive under certain biological conditions. If it gets too salty, I mean, they require salt to live, but if it gets too salty, they die. And I have these numbers listed at 18.5%. It's really 185 grams per liter. And I just did that by approximation. It's not quite right, but just go with me on this. Last year, we saw 185 grams per liter. Really, that's beyond where biologically the brine shrimp can function. And so we started to see a huge die-off on brine shrimp. So we really were concerned about that going into last year. Importantly as well, there are many other critters that live on the lake called brine flies. And brine flies, this is a creepy picture, I know, and I apologize for that. But all those black marks, that's all brine flies. And this is our state bird, the California seagull, out dining on those brine flies. Last year, as salinity reached that really high level on the south arm, we really did have a huge problem to where those brine shrimp, or I'm sorry, those brine flies virtually disappeared. And that alarms a lot of us because when you look at all the various animals that rely on those, it really is remarkable. And as Jan mentioned, 13 million plus birds rely on the Great Salt Lake year over year. Those 13 million birds become really part of our culture, but it's also, as saline lakes have dried up worldwide, the Great Salt Lake has become one of the last holdover points. And so this bird on the left is called the eared grebe. The eared grebe, really interesting bird. It will arrive in large numbers on the lake. Many of these birds molt on the lake, meaning they lose their feathers, and then they're reliant on whatever groceries they can pick up in the lake. And that those groceries happen to be brine shrimp in this case. And if there are no brine shrimp, large numbers of this bird population, either if they're molting there, they'll die and starve to death on the lake, or if they're not, then they will not have sufficient refuel as they travel these long migration distances, and they will perish in the journey. The other bird here is called the Wilson's phalarope, and the Wilson's phalarope is a shorebird. Also exists in large numbers, but about 80% of its existing habitat is on or around the Great Salt Lake. And so as we have the things that they eat go away, because that concerns us from an emotional level, but also from a regulatory level. On the national context, that regulatory level involves what we call the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act has been the law of the land since 1973, and really has been used by the federal government to say, hey, when we have a species that's in peril of going extinct, we really have to devote a lot of resources towards that species. It's been tried before the Supreme Court and found that, in fact, they meant what they said when they said they should protect endangered species. In fact, the court says this language admits no exception, meaning that, hey, you got to do what you say. As this applies to other cases involving water rights, the Klamath River case is actually really an interesting case up on the border of Oregon and California, to where agricultural interests have or thought they were going to have access to about 400,000 acre feet. And we talk in acre feet, that's a lot of water. An acre foot is, if you think about a football field about a foot deep in water, that's an acre foot. It's a lot of water. 400,000 is a lot. Well, they thought they had that much, but they had an endangered species or a couple of endangered fish species on the Klamath. And as a result, they only got 33,000 acre feet during these water years. And the rest went to fish flows. And that was alarming to the farmers and all others. Interestingly, from just a human interest story, the other people that lost that were individuals on the Crater Lake National Park. And at Crater Lake National Park, they had to truck water in based on the same concerns. So it's just interesting to see what could happen. And there's a lot of other cases where you can see how this law has been applied in other places. The humpback chub is used. This fish right here is used to justify a bunch of water releases out of Flaming Gorge to make sure we have sufficient fish flows and to wash some predatory fish down. This fish is called the June sucker. The June sucker lives in Utah Lake. About $44 million has been spent on saving that fish, not just getting water to the lake. That's $44 million to get water to the lake. This is the Utah prairie dog inhabits areas of around Cedar City, in Iron County, Garfield County, and other places, and really has been one of those things where it's been something that's been hard because the prairie dog lives in places where people like to build houses. Where there's prairie dogs, you can't build houses, and that's the cost. And then this fish is called the Delta smelt, and that fish has been really problematic in California. Not that the fish is problematic itself, but from the regulatory environment it creates in saving that fish, they've really turned off the spigots to a lot of areas in the central California Valley and the California Water Project, and it's caught a lot of people very concerned. That's just the ESA side. We're all concerned about the dust as well. And we know that as the lake has dried up, we've left long areas of this dried up area, which we call playa. That playa is really important when it comes to dust, because as it will actually have a crust initially, that crust eventually goes away, and then dust is kicked up. And when you see that, you see a fair amount of dust storms that come into the valley. Recently, and I actually brought even this, the Utah State Legislature identified their high risk list. And in their high risk list, one of the things they identified was dust. And in fact, they say on page 9 of this report, this is the Utah Office of Legislative Audit General, dust mitigation is estimated to be at a minimum $1.5 billion in capital costs, with ongoing annual maintenance of $15 million. Those estimates skyrocket if costs and affected surface area increase. So really, if that continues to be a dry area and a dry area with where dust comes off of, the cost of mitigating that is quite high. Another problem regarding that is dust and snowpack. As you mentioned, Jan, snow and dust don't react very well. Dust gets on the snowpack, changes the color. We see the snowpack melt quicker than we would see otherwise. And then obviously the federal government and state government cares deeply about air quality. Those air quality standards are quite important. They have in fact set regulatory standards at the PM 2.5. That's at micron levels of 2.5 microns, particulate matter is a problem that might actually get in your bloodstream. At PM 10, it gets into your lungs for sure. but both are regulated under the Clean Air Act. And it's possible the federal government will come in and say, listen, you really have to clean this up. And 1.5 billion may be cheap when it comes to that expense. Just looking at the Owens Lake case. And I say the Owens Lake case, that's a case in California where they saw the same type of problem where a terminal lake was dried up. The dust remediation on that was quite costly. And then I'm just going to mention this really briefly. There are other legal doctrines that could be applied. We were recently sued using the public trust doctrine that was utilized in the Mono Lake area of California. These things are called monos because the Spaniards thought they looked like monkeys. And so it's another saline lake, really important. And you end up with a lot of concern over how that's been applied. In the Mono Lake Public Trust Doctrine case, the state court said to the city of Los Angeles that owned the water rights, listen, you got to get more water to the lake, and mandated that through that case. There have been other cases invoking the public trust doctrine that I'm happy to answer in Q&A that have not had that same outcome. There's a recent one in Nevada that's a different outcome, but nonetheless. And then so the big question is, why is it shrinking? And we have spent a fair amount of time looking at that in a policy assessment. And so we formulated a strike team last fall with Utah State, University of Utah, and then the state agencies, DNR, Utah Department of Agriculture and Food, and the Department of Environmental Quality. In fact, you can track that on a graph line over time that, yes, indeed, the lake has fallen. And you can see a lot of variability in the lake over time. And we thought, well, why is that? We looked at precipitation, wondered if it's precipitation. It's not statistically significant, although you will see in the contemporary period these big troughs. Those big troughs are drought, and those big periods of drought do mean that we're getting less water reaching the lake. Next, we looked at mean northern Utah air temperature in the contemporary period. We do see higher air temperatures. That's alarming to us because it's like anyone who's put a kettle on heat, that we know that as the heat increases on the kettle, the likelihood of water evaporating out of the kettle is increased. The same goes for the Great Salt Lake, and we see more evaporative loss as increased temperatures happen. And then we get to stream flows, where we have stream flows in the Bear River, which is the largest contributor of inflow. You see that on the decline. The Weber River, you see that also on the decline, perhaps even more steeply than you do on the Bear. On the Jordan, you see a decline as well, although it's less pronounced. It's less pronounced, though, because we have plumbed the system through the Central Utah Project to bring water from the Colorado River over. So, Jan, even though you wanted to only talk about the Great Salt Lake, we get to mention the Colorado River as well to say, yep, they're connected now. And that plumbing system is not truly distinct anymore. And then if you look at, well, who's using the water, we have on water depletion, the largest water depleter is in agriculture. The second is in municipal and industrial use. And third, this is truly surprising to me, you have then this orange line, which is managed wetlands. As the lake has receded from those wetlands, in order to keep the wetlands wet, we put more water into the wetlands to keep them wet. It takes more water. And that's something, if we have that lake remain low and we want to preserve the wetlands, we will see more water usage in those wetlands itself, which is something, I mean, I think everyone can admit that wetlands are very important, but it's interesting that then that also becomes a water user in a way that we hadn't anticipated. Let's talk target lake elevation ranges. Just so we're clear on this, there is no magic bullet on how high the lake should be. The lake has been variable over time. In 2013, the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands took a hard look to say, where are those conditions to where you have the most profitable salinity for those creatures that we care about, as well as profitable for those mineral companies that operate around the outside of the lake, as well as better for people when it comes to dust and other concerns. And they identified really this green zone right here, where between 4198 and 4205, where they think that's the optimal range of the lake. That's not to say that has to be where the lake is to be good, but we should also be aware that the further away we get out of that, the more serious consequences we face when it comes to dust or when it comes to those high salinities. And that high salinity, like I mentioned at the outset, we were so concerned about back when we were in this level, that we really thought we were going to have a catastrophic die-off of species. We desperately wanted to avoid that. And we took the very serious consequence, or the very serious action to take that causeway and build a berm a little higher in the causeway so that we were able to keep more water on the south arm to keep those salinity levels lower as we got runoff. And so we saw that. Right now, the lake is sitting around this level right here. So better, but not great. And we had bounced up earlier in the year on that south arm to really about 4194, which is still much better than where we were, way out of that deep red zone, but not in a place where we think we need to be in order to avoid some of those consequences. So we're really looking to get more water into the lake. How do we do that? Well, here's the rub. My job is to go out and make sure that we can identify policy options to do what we can. The problem is all those policy options have benefits and trade-offs. And I would like to say that there was one that was cost-free, but unfortunately, we haven't identified one that's cost-free. And so just be aware as we consider these trade-offs that it's not a single silver bullet. We're going to have to do many things. There's many pieces to the puzzle, and that we're dealing with many other water problems at once. So just as a for instance, one of the options that people have often decided, what we should do to save the Great Salt Lake is bring in more of that water through that plumbing system on the Colorado River. And that from an engineering standpoint is really, really simple to do. And I'm making Teresa very uncomfortable with this. But it's easy to do. But the reality is, if we were to do that, that causes all sorts of other problems on the Colorado River system. And the Colorado River system is also something that a lot of people are concerned about. And so there's just those trade-offs between these different options. So the things that we're seriously considering. One, I think that we as a state need to really consider limiting municipal and industrial water growth. And let me be very clear on this. I'm not saying we limit growth. I'm saying we limit how we use water as we grow. And I say that because I don't think we're going to be able to build a fence around this. And while sometimes I desperately want to kick my kids out of my house, I'm sure at some point I'm going to want them nearby. And if they want to live in Utah, I would like to give them the option to do so. So I think that we have to be smarter on how we grow. And that means that we really have to look at more water savings and how we use our landscaping and on how we use just water within the buildings that we do. So we can have that by saying we're going to have policies for new growth on how we do that, as well as policies for existing growth or for existing habitation. And so you're seeing the state really lead off into this when we're coming to say we're going to have turf removal programs, or we're going to have, other benefits, but really we're at just the front end of where we probably need to be, because we expect there will be a lot more growth in the state. We need to be very serious on how we grow and make sure that it's not eating more of that water budget away.
Brian,
yes.
I am sorry to interrupt you, but I think we need to hear from Teresa, and maybe we can get back to some of your solutions later on as we work through the program.
Happily do that. Thank you, Jan.
One thing in particular that I think I would like to hear you talk about at some point this evening is what your job is, what you hope to accomplish, and things like that. So
absolutely.
Teresa,
can you chime
sure.
in?
I wanted to hear Brian's solutions. No. So let me go ahead and share my screen as well. And so I'm Teresa Wilhelmsen. I serve as the Utah State Engineer and Director of the Division of Water Rights. And I get to manage, and I'm sharing a screen here. If you bear with me for just a minute. Hang on. Let's see here. Oh, can you see that screen?
Yep.
Yes.
My slides there? Okay. I just need to adjust so I can see you guys as well. So I'm Teresa Wilhelmsen. I serve as Utah State Engineer, and my job basically entails telling the water where to go and oversee the water right system within the state of Utah. So let me just start with this slide, and my little friend here, Drought. This is actually a picture that was taken by one of our water law attorneys that practice in the state. And I think it just really emphasizes that, and we've used this on different presentations, but it just really emphasizes what Brian was getting at, just how interconnected water is to everything. And you know, it's just kind of like that spider web that you pull one strand and that whole web comes with it, and it moves. And that's exactly what Brian was explaining there, is he's trying to find some solutions. Where is that give and take, and what is okay? So let me just dive into some of the complexities. Brian got at some of these watersheds with his slides. This particular graphic here shows the Bear River system, and it does start in the headwaters of the Uintas, goes through Wyoming, comes back to Utah, back to Wyoming, through Idaho, and then back to Utah. This slide shows some of the major or the larger surface sources and conveyances and some of the significant reservoirs, but it's only a fraction of these sources and diversions that we manage as we get the water where it needs to go according to the prior appropriation system. This is the Weber River system. It's a very complex system as well. And you actually see in that number 5, if you can see that number 5 on the screen, that's actually transporting water from the Weber River system to the Provo system. So you can see how interconnected a lot of these basin systems are and how they deliver water to end up in the Great Salt Lake. The Jordan, this is another very complex system where we move water, and in that slide you see the Duchesne Tunnel, you see Strawberry, and those are the exact diversions that Brian was mentioning that bring water from the Colorado River system to the Wasatch Front. And a lot of that water is highly relied upon for, you know, municipal systems that use that water. So this is a very complex system that contributes water to the Great Salt Lake. And this slide just emphasizes, and I'm going to let this slide kind of play out here, but it just emphasizes how interconnected these systems are, and is how we could move water, pipe it, get it to where those water rights need it to be, but also be able to get water distributed, or if you want to use the term shepherded, to the lake, Great Salt Lake for purposes, or even on the Colorado River system for purposes there as well. And I'm going to talk about in the next few slides just how we do that and some of the tools that we have to manage the water system and actually quantify, measure, report that information, provide it to the public so that it's available and transparent to the public. But a very interconnected system. It's not just a simple delivery system to manage. So let me let this just play out for just a second, and maybe I'll talk about just the differences with prior appropriation system. So in the West, we have what's called the prior appropriation system, very different than in the East where we have the riparian system. Our water laws are based on that prior appropriation system, which is first in time, first in right. And it does have a kind of another catchy little term, use it or lose it. And primarily what that was intended was so someone couldn't hoard water and just hold on to it and not use it. It's available to be used under the water rate system. So the Office of the State Engineer, we essentially have and administer, we're responsible for regulating the appropriation and distribution, apportionment, measurement of the waters of the state. We maintain over 200,000 water rights in the state. They all have a priority, and they all are constrained by the available water supply. Not every water right is satisfied every year. And in fact, the majority typically are cut based on hydrology. So a water right has some basic fundamental principles that give it limits. And so a water right would have a defined beneficial use, a priority date, a quantity, point of diversion, place of use, and then ownership of that water right. And it's a right to use the public's water. How we manage these systems with all of those elements, a lot of times what we will have on each of these river systems are distribution accounting models. This is just a schematic from one of our models for above Midway, and you can see how we track on a daily basis how water comes into the system, is stored in the system, and is delivered through diversions in the system. And we create these distribution accounting models to help us do this and provide that information to the public. So let me just talk about a couple principles that we have to maintain. And it comes down to what we call diversion, depletion, and then return flows. So with every change in a water right, we have to make sure that we are protecting existing rights that have been applied for, that were there first. And every system, as this graphic shows, you can see as you go through that system, we have to account for the diversion, how that water's used, where return flow comes back to the system, which may supply that next diversion on down the system, goes into a reservoir, we meter it, comes back out for another, and then eventually that return flow makes its way to the Great Salt Lake, in this case on this slide. So let me just do a little graphic here to kind of explain or show how diversion, depletion, and return flows, and the considerations that we have to make in every decision of the state engineer to shepherd water or move water through a system and not affect existing rights. So you have in every system, whether it's groundwater, surface water, you have a natural flow of that system. Then you may have a diversion that comes out of that natural flow and is applied, in this case, to irrigation to a plant. You're going to have from that use a conveyance loss or return flow that returns to that natural flow to satisfy those rights, intervening rights. Then you're going to have that plant will actually consume some of the water, some will evaporate, and then you have some deep percolation also that comes back to the system. Then you may have runoff off that field that contributes the return flows back to that natural flow to satisfy those rights on that system. And then that is where it goes on downstream to satisfy those rights, whatever those may be. You have precipitation that comes in that we have to account for, and that totals the evapotranspiration. So what I wanted to just demonstrate with this slide is how micro level we look at each of these deliveries and each of these water rights on the system as we manage these water rights. You know, Brian really focuses a lot on that macro level and how all of those systems come to play. We really do dive into the weeds or the wetlands, whatever it is, to manage these systems. So let me talk about what the state has done to really address some of the issues with the Great Salt Lake and trying to help Brian in answering some of the questions that he needs to. So this last year, the legislature did fund several $1 million for the water right division. For ongoing water distribution, measurement, and automation. It's very key when you think about that complexity, that map that I showed you of all of those various blue bands of water moving. We have head gates like is pictured here that we have to measure the amount of water that's diverted. You know, we used to go out, turn that head gate. We still turn a lot of head gates, but we have technology now where we can automate those measurements. And so this funding that was the legislature appropriated really will help us be able to automate those systems. We also received $5 million one time to look at water measurement enhancements and data enhancements to get at our database, make it more transparent, make it more understandable, and then some ongoing funds so we can maintain the measurements. There's equipment that we install and we need to maintain those long term. We also were appropriated $650,000 for water distribution priority schedules. And we have a team that is working, making our records much more clear. So the state has really done a lot to invest in these existing systems and provide the resources that we need. The 2023 legislative session, it was that significant, another significant investment with appropriations, and I'm talking beyond the Division of Water Rights with this slide. Many other agencies touch the water space here in Utah, but appropriations totaling over 500 million one time and 164 million ongoing. And that built upon similar investments in 2022 of about $1 billion. So a lot of money is being invested by the state of Utah to address the issues with the Great Salt Lake. Some of the policy changes that we've seen to water law, sometimes people may say water law is archaic, and it just needs to go away or needs to be reinvented. Well, water law has evolved over these years. It's been around for 125 years, but every year there are changes that are made to address current issues. In the 2022 session, we saw a modification to the in-stream flow bill, which really broadened and allowed for other agencies like forestry, fire, and state lands to be able to acquire water rights and have them distributed to the Great Salt Lake. So it was an amendment that changed water law and helped us address some of the issues here. This last session, there were a couple of bills directly to the Great Salt Lake. One dealt with water use projects, water reuse projects, and how those need to be accounted for in the Great Salt Lake Basin. We also saw another bill that defines saved water under agricultural optimization projects, and that will incentivize farmers to improve their on-farm efficiencies and be able to quantify that depletion savings to potentially have that contribute to another use, or a use like under an in-stream flow or something like that. Some of the administrative actions that we've done, the governor issued a proclamation suspending new appropriations in the Great Salt Lake Basin this last year. And then we are actively having public meetings within these areas to talk about issues and help communities understand what their water rights are and how they can be used. So a lot of action, policy change, and administrative action have been taken in regarding the issues here. So one of the last things I just wanted to mention is, what are we looking at for the future in the Division of Water Rights in the State Engineer's Office in managing the state's water? We are looking to support more accurate ongoing measurement, getting diversions telemetered, which means that we install the equipment, like you can see in the picture here, that sends that signal so that that diversion amount comes right to our database so that we can manage on a more real-time basis the deliveries of water under these water rights. Right now, we're conducting a gap analysis on the Great Salt Lake Basin of where we need measurement. And we've partnered with Utah State University to do that, to get that gap analysis done. We're also building additional distribution accounting models, which help us make transparent that data so that the public can know where and at what quantity the water is within the state. And also looking at hydroinformatics to look at our data. We have 125 years of data, and we're making that more transparent and more usable by all agencies, including Brian, as he's looking to solve these issues, and just making it transparent across the state. So, with that, I just wanted to give a brief look at what we do here at the Division of Water Rights. And happy to address any questions and happy to be here. And I just really appreciate the invitation to talk about what we do. So thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. That was great information. And I can see that you and Brian are going to be talking a lot here in the next few months and years as he gets his job up and running. And I hope to learn a little bit more about that as we move along. Nate, are you here?
Yep, I'm right here.
All right. Would you kindly introduce yourself a little bit and then tell us what you think is coming up?
Yeah, and I can be pretty quick. I don't have slides or anything. So this is all great information. This is stuff I've seen before and it's still informative. So I appreciate all the work Teresa and Brian have done. You know, I will say I was a little bit, well, I'll start with an intro. So Nate Blouin, I'm a state senator here in Sugar House, South Salt Lake, Mill Creek, Murray, a little bit of West Valley City. This is my first term, going into my second session. So I ran a resolution last year that was related to this target elevation. It got more attention than I expected. And so it's been really fun following along with what's going on at the lake. It's an important issue to, I mean, every single one of my constituents. It's probably the issue I hear most about from the conversations I have with people these days. So I do want to say, yeah, thank you to Brian on this new position he's got. I know he was a little bit skeptical going in, and I was a little bit skeptical of the position, but we've got the right person here. And so I'm excited to see what he brings forward in the next couple of months. I know he's got a lot of hard work to do to bring forward some recommendations. And so I think, you know, whatever he presents to us in I don't know if that's October, November, whenever that comes forward, those you know, ideas that he comes up with in all of his conversations are going to be critical. And I think the legislation that we see this year, you know, and it's him, it's Teresa in the engineer's office, DNR, DEQ, the Department of Water Resources, the Department of Agriculture and Food, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. I mean, all these agencies, they don't get enough credit. We do want to move quickly on this, and in their world, we are moving very quickly. I know there's a ton of work going on, and we don't always hear that. So I do want to say thank you to everyone who's doing that work. So I think, you know, just to go quickly here, I think what we're going to see this year, we've been seeing some work on lithium and mineral extraction. That's a big deal. There's the potential to use hundreds of thousands of acre feet every year for lithium extraction. I am a big proponent of lithium extraction. It is something we need for the clean energy transition, for utility scale batteries and things along those lines that we are going to need if we're going to build out more wind and solar. We've got to do it in a way that's really you know, well thought out, and of course the lake is an immediate concern where we can't spare a year or two on the action. So there's going to be legislation on that. I'm a little worried kind of how it's being framed, and that maybe it's almost being framed as a little bit of a distraction from some of the agricultural conversations that I think are still critical. But you know, that agricultural conversation is huge. Representing urban Wasatch Front area, you know, I wish I was able to have more conversations with our farmers and our ranchers and that sort of thing. It's something I'd welcome the opportunity to do, because we definitely see a pretty big urban-rural divide. And you know, while I would personally be in favor of things that incentivize or pay for or mandate you know, water conservation from agriculture, a lot of those things are really just not politically viable. You know, I was at a forum in Wyoming a couple of weeks ago, specifically related to the Colorado River, but we heard from a lot of agricultural folks that there's just this, you know, cultural attachment to the work that they do. And so even to convince them to get paid for conserving a third cutting of alfalfa every year is a really big ask. And so, you know, I don't know what we're going to see specifically in that line, but it is something I would totally support, but I think it's a huge political ask. So I don't know what we're going to see there. As Teresa kind of touched on, I think a lot of these pieces are absolutely critical. The technology, the metering, the telemetry, monitoring along the lines. I think there's probably going to be work done on that to spend more money on those systems. And I think that's kind of low-hanging fruit. There's not a lot of low-hanging fruit left here, I don't think. But I think as far as the money we could spend, that's probably some of the best bang for the buck from what I'm hearing. And then also staffing. I mean, really giving these agencies the bodies they need to do this work. That's something I've seen across water, across energy. There's a lack of engineers and a lack of people with technical skills because we're hiring in the public sector. We need to be paying them in line with the private sector and trying to keep up there. And so I think that's an absolutely huge thing that gets overlooked. It's just putting the people in there that can do the work and grind out these studies and these water rights adjudications and things like that. I think that gets overlooked a lot. So we've got there's all these other big ideas I'd love to address. Target levels. I think those are great tools and mandates for certain things. I'm a Democrat. I'm a progressive guy. That doesn't scare me, but it's not necessarily a real popular political conversation here in Utah. So, I haven't totally decided what I'm going to bring forward yet this year myself. But hopefully we can kind of figure out some of these pieces here and work together and address some of these real necessary short-term concerns that are coming up because, as has been said, over and over, we bought ourselves maybe a couple of years with the water we got this year, but we need long-term solutions. The lake is already back down to, I think, 4191 point something. So we're already down a couple of feet and trending down towards that historical low, and we can't keep sitting there. It's not sustainable for the economy, for the bird populations, the brine shrimp and the flies, and of course our public health. So it's a problem we've got to solve, and I hope we can find the will to do it. And I'll leave it there, and yeah, happy to. Hopefully we have some time for questions, and happy to jump in there.
Thanks, Nate. We do have time for questions, but I wanted to, since we had a couple extra minutes here, go back to Brian, and maybe you could continue your conversation about some of the solutions that we can look forward to or that we are considering as we move forward with trying to solve this incredible problem.
Sure. And Jan, I'll go back and tell you a little bit more about the commissioner's office as well, if you'd like.
That would be great. Yeah.
So the commissioner's office was set up in this past legislative session as a coordinating function between the various state agencies that have interest on the lake. If we talk about Department of Natural Resources, just as a for instance, we have Teresa, the state engineer in the Division of Water Rights. We also have a Division of Water Resources. We have Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And Forestry, Fire, and State Lands manages the bed of the lake. Division of Water Resources manages the planning aspects of how water gets to where, not the rights of where water goes, but kind of those planning of how water is developed. And then we have other agencies like the Division of Wildlife Resources that really are managing the brine shrimp. We have Division of Recreation that manages the recreational assets, as well as the Division of State Parks that manages at least 2 state park units on the Great Salt Lake. And so there's all of this, not just in one department, right? Add to that we have additional departments in the Division the Department of Environmental Quality, and we end up with lots of different places that could go. The commissioner's office is set up to be the clearinghouse of the information dealing with the lake to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction. It's tasked to work with those same entities, as well as to go out and work with federal entities as well. So one of the things we're working on is to work with our federal partners, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to make sure that we're all working as one cohesive whole to make sure that we're doing the right things in the lake. So that's what we're trying to do. In the substantive policy question, I've been tasked with 3 things. 1, to set up an office in the short term. 2, to make sure that office is putting together a plan to save the Great Salt Lake. And then 3, to start coordinating bringing more water to the lake. And so I'll focus on that third portion right here. As Teresa mentioned, water in the Great Salt Lake Basin has all been allocated. There's a lot of people with vested interest in that. And so we really have to start having a conversation of how we're going to get people to use that water differently and make sure that we can bring that water in some safe ways. On the agricultural front, there can be major savings in water by using different technologies. And we're trying to figure out how we can best apply those technologies and then use that saved water, maybe pay the farmers or ranchers for the saved water, or or otherwise incentivize that water going from where it's saved to where it's needed in the Great Salt Lake. So working on that front. Similarly, if that is not sufficient, I think that we have to start talking about how we might be more aggressive. And I know that as Senator Blouin mentioned, he's been talking with farmers and ranchers in Wyoming. I can tell you that our farmers and ranchers are as passionate as those in Wyoming because water has been their lifeblood. And so working with them to say, how do we incentivize maybe that third cutting of alfalfa, or incentivizing maybe even taking, starting the watering season 2 weeks later, or stopping the watering season earlier. And we've been working with a variety of agricultural producers on that front. In fact, tomorrow I'm meeting with the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food to start furthering those conversations of how we work together on that front on agricultural optimization. And then I think the real key is to make sure that whether it's saved water on the municipal side or saved water on the agricultural side, that we're able to deliver that water from where it's being conserved to where we need it in the Great Salt Lake. And that's that shepherding component that Teresa has been talking about. And that requires a little more monitoring than we currently have set up. And so we're putting in that monitoring as well as making sure that that water does reach the point of destination.
Brian, can I just ask you a quick question and then we'll go to the our participants? Is the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Management Plan coming out of, is that your responsibility?
Interestingly, that plan was set up before the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office was established. That was set up not this legislative session, but the year before. And so that was ongoing. But yes, when you look at the schematics of who the Great Salt Lake Integrated Plan is going to, it's actually reporting up through the Commissioner's Office. And I've been involved in all of the planning on what we're doing now. One of the downsides of that plan, while it's extraordinarily valuable, is that it's going to take 3 years to get done.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to make decisions within the next 2 years before we have all that information. And so trying to figure that out. So it's really utilizing the information as it rolls in to make the best informed policy decisions that we can in the short and the medium term.
Brian, I've been notified that there are many people who would really love to see the rest of your slides. So first of all, I apologize for interrupting you and to everyone else. And I'm wondering if that's possible.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide these if you'd like as well. And maybe that may be the thing to do. Would that be easier? Do you think we could send them out, or would you like just to go through where we were?
Well, people seem to want to see them. so if you could do that,
What they want, I guess. I'll go very quickly through the remainders. One moment.
Great. Thank you. And then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay. Let me see if I can pull this up. All right. So data optimization is, I think, where it was. If you look at this and you have different technological uses, I mean, we all are familiar with these pivots, right? These pivots were put in to be a water savings device from flood irrigation. One of the problems with those pivots is they actually are pretty efficient in using water. And every time you sprinkle water on the surface, some of that water doesn't get back in. It turns out it's more efficient if you can get more water down further on the ground. So there's 2 different systems to change the pressure and other things. So you can get about a 15% reduction in diversions off that. And then if you look at this going forward, you can actually have increased amount of that, those diversions. But eventually, if we're going to have a huge amount of water savings, we really are talking about those deficit programs to where we're paying people to produce less agriculture. One of the things this graph does not entail is crop switching. If we were to switch out from alfalfa to, say, wheat, we would have less water used because it's a smaller watering season. That's something that we need to explore more. One of the reasons people don't do that is there's not a very robust wheat market in the West, simply because it's hard to get it from point of production to point of consumption. And then just lastly, as we talked about, regardless of what we do to save water, we really have to set up more robust water banks and water markets. And what I mean by that is we need to make sure that when we optimize that agricultural water, that we're able to get it in large tranches into the Great Salt Lake. And that's something that Teresa and I are going to have to work very closely on, because that's something that scares a lot of people, and rightfully so. And then making sure that we get those water rights shepherded back to the Great Salt Lake, or similarly, if we have water neutral M&I growth or municipal industrial growth, to get that water to where it needs to be, but also get as much back into the lake as we can. And so trying to do both those things. And so that's what we intend to do going forward. And with that, I'm done with my slides. So Jan, just like that, the people now have what they want. So
All right,
I'll
great.
stop sharing. Thanks.
Thank you for doing that. And I think now we'll open it up to questions from our attendees. And so I've asked Norma Wills, the other co-author who helped put kind of shepherd this project through, to kind of take a look at that. So if Norma, if you can help us through that.
Okay,
Go
wait,
ahead.
I got it. Sorry, my thing messed up here for a minute. So this looks like a question for Teresa. The question's from Steve Hardy, and it's, wouldn't Great Salt Lake have priority rights as the result of being here first?
I think that would be a question for me. You know, and unfortunately, the Great Salt Lake doesn't have a water right. You know, the prior appropriation system really envisioned placing the water to a beneficial use. And at the time, the Great Salt Lake wasn't seen as having or being a beneficial use. It's I think kind of interesting that has really changed over the last probably decade, that we realize that it does have value and you know, purpose to the economy, to the community, to the people in Utah. And through some of these legislative changes that we have made, there have been ways now under the prior appropriation system to get water to the lake.
And can I riff on that just a little bit? So one of those changes was to allow for an in-stream flow right that is more robust than what we had initially in Utah state law. And I mean, think about this in pioneer terms. People thought that, you know, if it wasn't being directly applied to something they perceived was growing something or someone that was drinking, they didn't think it was that useful. We now have evolved beyond that to know that indeed we have many uses, including the Great Salt Lake being useful. So that in-stream flow right is one. Secondly, they have expanded the number of people that are able to hold water rights on the Great Salt Lake to include Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Division of Wildlife Resources, and others that are able to ensure that once water gets there, that priority remains intact. And that's something I think it's a really important concept, and it's something that I would really commend Teresa and her crew for helping influence, because it's hard to do. And for Senator Blouin to you know, be supportive of it, it's important as well.
Okay, let me see if this works. Can you see the question now or not?
I cannot.
Okay, I'll just read them. So this is from Steve Glasser. Again, I think this is for Teresa. If a farmer leases some of their water rights, dedicating them to the Great Salt Lake, how does that work? If 1 million acre feet go to the lake already, and the farmer is sending an additional acre foot, does 1,000,001 acre feet make it to the lake? Or does someone with junior water rights take an additional acre foot so that there is still only 1 million acre feet going to the lake?
Perfect question, Steve. With these changes in law, and it is my job to make sure that 1,000,001 acre foot goes. If a farmer does lease that 1 acre foot, I need to get it there. And that's the monitoring, additional monitoring, measuring, accounting, data enhancements that we need in getting that data real time to be able to account for it more accurately and make sure that it does get there. And we are seriously, we could be trying to move 1 acre foot of water out of 1 million. So very, very important. And that is the whole purpose of a lot of the changes to law, the investments in the metering and measuring, and the job that I need to do.
Thank you. We have a question from former Representative Elizabeth Waite. This is for Brian. The Great Salt Lake Institute has been studying the life and resiliency of the microbiolite habitats in Great Salt Lake. Please explain, and do you know what the projections are for the recovery of those structures barely submerged this year?
So it's an excellent question. You know, I talked to Bonnie Baxter more than I care to admit. And so, yeah, in fact, I was on the phone with her earlier today. It's a really important question. Here, the ecosystem of the lake is complex. And what a lot of people don't realize is right under the surface of the lake level itself, there are kind of reef-like structures, microbialites and communities that actually support those brine flies and lesser brine shrimp, but mostly brine flies. In talking to Bonnie, she informs me that it's not a one-to-one, right? If it's dry for a year, the chances are you can't actually get it re-wet, and that re-wetting then can have it recover. I still am going down to see her lab because they've been running this experiment for some time, but it does take some time for the recovery of that. And if it's left high and dry for too long, there will be no recovery. And so one of the things that was really beneficial about this year and getting that big infusion of water on the south arm is covering up a lot of those areas and re-wetting them in a way that is meaningful. We haven't got all of them yet, and I think that it's something that we're watching. Interestingly as well, the new research they're getting out of the Great Salt Lake Institute is pretty cool because the brine flies, which we really were terrified last year that they may be gone, right? We were going out and doing surveys at the end of the year, just not seeing a whole bunch. They had salty holes, essentially, salty springs where they all kind of went and hung out, and now they're back. If you were to go out, not now, but earlier in the year, you would have seen clouds of those brine flies again, which is the sign that there is a recovery there. That's something that honestly we have to track pretty closely, and it's interesting because I think brine flies become a bit of a canary in the coal mine, and to that extent, those microbialites become equally as important to figure out how to make sure that they remain healthy. So good question. I wish I had more direct information to say that we're all good. We're better than we were. And I'm encouraged to hear that you can re-wet them and they actually have biological integrity still, but still more work to do there.
Thank you. This is a question from Jeff. As plans and proposed legislation are developed to save Great Salt Lake, what are elected officials and agency directors doing to preserve aquatic habitat and in-stream flows that support aquatic wildlife, especially fish? Angling contributes roughly $1.3 billion in economic benefits to the state economy. There are over 500,000 licensed anglers in Utah. In saving the lake, will aquatic wildlife and angling be considered and protected?
Yeah, maybe go ahead, Nate.
I think absolutely. I think from what I've heard that's a very active community who have good inroads with elected officials. You know, they are well versed in making their voices heard, and I think they have great experiences. So I think their concerns will absolutely be heard on the Hill.
And I think maybe just to add from a kind of a management perspective, that's how we will get water to the lake is through those streams. You know, Wildlife Resources is partnering with a lot of entities with water rights to do in-stream flows throughout the basin, and that will continue. And there are mechanisms to do that now.
And anecdotally, it's really important to me too, because I'm a fisherman. So I like fly fishing, and it's my source of relaxation. I'm a terrible golfer. I'm a pretty bad fly fisherman as well, but I like it a lot more.
Well, that's good. If you have a personal interest, it has a better shot, right? Here's a question from Heather Dove. Is there, and you touched on this earlier, Brian, is there any discussion yet about growing less thirsty crops than alfalfa and other hays? Is there any discussion about making our agriculture less cattle-centric? Is there discussion about limiting how much water-heavy product can be sold to foreign countries, effectively sending our scarce and extremely cheap water out of the state without much benefit to the state while depleting our precious supplies?
So all very good points. Let's start with the last first. On export of alfalfa, I mean, I don't think that there has been laws yet that I've seen encouraging that. I think that the U.S. Constitution on Commerce Clause really does encourage that interstate commerce between different states, and then allows for international regulation to happen at the federal level. And I'm just not seeing that conversation take place. So that's a technical answer, but I do think it's important to account for how much water is being used. As to alfalfa itself, alfalfa, I think sometimes is kind of painted as the devil's crop. I don't think it's the devil's crop. I think that there is a lot of good that can come from alfalfa. One of the things I like personally about it is that you're able to do what Senator Blouin was mentioning, that if you were able to say, hey, we need water this year, and we're going to say, I'm going to pay you not water this year, that crop can go dormant essentially, and then not require replanting the next year. So you don't have that cloud disturbance, which is really good from a water sense as well as from a lot of ecological sense. So there's some benefits there. That being said, obviously we need to start talking about how we use water, and start talking about how we use water in a way that allows for us to get the food we need, while also having the water we need for the various needs on that water. And one of those needs on the water is the Great Salt Lake. So I think that that's a conversation that's ongoing. I think that we have to approach this as ag being part of the solution and not as the problem. And it's been my experience that if they're pointed out as the problem, well, then I think that there's a lot of conflict and fighting that goes on that, rather than collaboration and trying to solve problems. And I'm hoping that we can be in the commissioner's office more on that collaborative side, working with agriculture to find those long-term solutions.
Okay. We have a question from Nikki Nelson. Evaporation is a big loss. What about covering canals with solar panels?
Yeah, I can touch. That's definitely something I've seen. I think there are some other states or even countries that have experimented with that, and I think there are some pretty good results. It's something I think that's certainly worth looking into. I've kind of looked at some other opportunities for building solar or battery storage, or that obviously this is specific to solar panels. You couldn't put batteries on the top of a canal. That wouldn't work well. But with solar panels, I think it's a very valid concern. So it's something I maybe I'll look more into. I think that's a good suggestion.
And I do think that, oh, go ahead, Teresa, sorry.
I was just going to add that a lot of the ag optimization projects that we see are piping of those canals to help with that evaporation loss.
I would also say I work at Utah State University as part of my job. I work at a place called the Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air. And one of the research projects that we're actually looking at is kind of that how ag and solar can work together. Which is there are things you can do there, and I would also really encourage as much coverage of those waterways as possible, because the canals, not the river systems, but the canals, because I do think that that's the real deal, and can have water savings. If it's solar, I think that there's a lot of great that can come of it. So
that brings up a lot of ideas for me. So that's a great talking point right there. Appreciate that.
Okay, this gets back to the agricultural water optimization also. So apparently at the People's Great Salt Lake Summit in the ag breakout room, there was a calculation that said if all the strategies work out, it will only save 200,000 acre feet per year, when it seems to be agreed upon that we need 1 to 1.5 million acre feet per year to the lake. So I guess the question is, how do we make up the shortfall?
So can I jump on that just for a second, because I think I know that guy that said that number. I think it was Matt Yost. And here's what I would say. It really depends on how fast we're aiming to refill the lake. If you're looking to refill the lake within 5 years, then yes, it requires that higher water number. If you're looking to do it more gradually over a longer time frame that requires less water, we've done a fair amount of research in terms of what that actual number is. If you're looking at the water years that preceded 2020, the 2022-2023 winter, we were probably in about a 400,000 acre foot deficit, right? That was on average what you're looking at in terms of just the amount of water that had on average getting there. The good news is that some years are variable. We have much more water that gets into the lake. So this year is a good year. We had a bunch more water that flowed in, and it would be less than that. I think, to be very honest, that if we were to get more water, even if it were just 200,000 acre feet, that would be a huge get for the lake. And actually, you can see real positive benefits. And so I don't want to say that's a bad thing. Teresa, you can add on to that. I'm sorry.
No, I think you said it well. Yeah.
200,000 extra acre feet is a lot of water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and we combine a couple of questions here. One is how many farmers are leasing their water rights? I presume this means to the lake. And then second part would be how much water has been diverted back to the lake so far from these existing programs?
So Teresa, do you have those numbers, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
Yeah, so I can kind of estimate as far as projects or actual change applications, we're just starting to see a lot of them. We probably have 3 or 4 right now, but we are getting a lot of questions, I guess I would say. So I think that's really, the number's going to just really accelerate when you think about it. Some of these laws just went into play, and even some just in this year. So people are they're asking the questions, they're looking into it. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot more. This year so far, I've approved probably about 20,000, right in the ballpark, about 20,000 acre feet under some applications recently this year. So Brian, do you have something else to add there?
So I would just say, if you look at the numbers from the Great Salt Lake Trust that has been working on this over the last couple of years, the numbers probably around 60,000 acre feet, which is not enough, but it's a pretty good start. And considering that there is a fair amount of those that will remain in perpetuity dedicated to the lake, that's actually a pretty big deal. I would also say, as to Teresa's point, I'm hearing from farmers and ranchers more that are interested in this. I had a call yesterday from a realtor, oddly enough, that was interested in a ranch property that had, I don't know the exact number, but it was thousands of acre feet that they were interested in getting involved. So I think it's going to be a trend that grows, but it's something that is also going to require a diligent hand on our part to make sure that people understand what's at stake, and that understand that it's not the end of the world to lease your water rights.
Yeah, I think the more monitoring we get and the more data we can collect, the more people are going to trust that the system works, is my understanding. There's a lot of trepidation, I think, from potential lessors, whatever the right word is there, that might be willing to contribute if they can really be assured that water is going to make it to the lake.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is probably for Teresa as well. How involved or interested are other states, say Wyoming and Idaho, in taking a role or responsibility for Great Salt Lake?
That is an interesting question, but folks should know. So there is an interstate compact on the Bear. I serve as Utah's commissioner, along with the state engineer of Idaho and the state engineer of Wyoming. We do coordinate on that river with the deliveries, and we talk about it often. Previously, the previous state engineer in Idaho actually grew up and loved the Great Salt Lake, hunting, fishing, spending a lot of time around the lake. And so he was very aware. He did just retire. So there's a new state engineer in Idaho, but we still have regular conversations, discussions. They know it's not in their backyard like it is ours. They're a little more distant, but they definitely are not tone deaf to the issues with the Great Salt Lake. That's for sure.
And I would say that from the commissioner standpoint, we are going to be actively in communication with those states because with the bear especially, it starts in Utah, it runs through Wyoming, runs back into Utah, then runs into Idaho, and then runs back into the Great Salt Lake. And so they do have to be part of the solution as well. And if there is that kind of adverse regulatory action, whether if it comes from an endangered species listing, for instance, that will not respect those state boundaries. They have to be aware that there's some jeopardy there as well. And trying to figure out how to avoid that drastic consequence, I think, is something that they should be interested also.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ryan, Norma, I think we need to stop with the questions now.
Well, we finished up, so that worked well.
It's great. And I really want to thank Brian and Teresa and Nate for participating in this panel and for your involvement in Great Salt Lake issues and your interest and all the great good work that you're doing. I appreciate it. We appreciate it very much. A couple of announcements, and I think I'm going to go back to Norma on this. As I mentioned before, we identified 2 priorities in our report, Great Salt Lake and Colorado River. Norma is going to be moderating a panel on the Colorado River on October 17th. And so I'd like her to just briefly tell you about the panelists that we'll be having there, and then why Utahns should be caring about Colorado River. So Norma, if you could go forth with that.
Sure. One thing I'll just point out before I do that is that the program tonight has been recorded, and it will be available on the League of Women Voters of Utah website probably tomorrow. So if anybody knows of someone who missed it and would like to listen in, it'll be available then. So yes, thanks, Jan. As she said, we in our water report, we identified 2 important priorities for Utah, which we covered Great Salt Lake tonight. And the other issue is the Colorado River, and that was also mentioned tonight by our panelists. So we're going to be doing a webinar with 3 panelists. We'll have Candace Hassenjager, who's the director of the Division of Water Resources. She's also a member of the board of the Colorado River Authority of Utah. And we're hoping for her to give us an overview of the situation in the Colorado River Basin, and also hopefully point us towards some solutions where water is scarce in that system as well. We also are going to have Mr. Paul Tosi, who is the tribal representative on the Colorado River Authority of Utah board, because tribal rights were not considered in the original 1922 compact for the river. And those water rights precede the settlers' water rights that came later. And so now as people are trying to figure out how to manage the river into the future, it seems appropriate that those considerations be taken into account. The other thing is that since it was pointed out tonight that agriculture uses such a large portion of our water in Utah, that one of the biggest pieces for conserving water is through the agricultural water optimization program. And so we've invited Hannah Fries to join us to give us an update on how, first of all, explain the program, how it works, and give us some feedback on how well things are working. So I hope you'll be able to join us on Tuesday, October 17th at 6 o'clock. And we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you all again for joining the panel. It's been very informative.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Norma. With that, I think we will end our webinar just a minute or two early. And thanks again to everybody that listened in and to our incredible 3 panelists. Thank you.